The years that followed Jake's 6th birthday party became a careful dance of avoidance and pretense. Sarah learned to read the signs in her son's face, the subtle shift in his posture when David's name was mentioned, the way his breathing would change when they drove past his uncle's house. She began scheduling their lives around Jake's unspoken fears, making excuses for missed family gatherings, declining invitations that would put them in David's presence for extended periods. But David was persistent. He was family after all, and family doesn't just disappear because a child goes through a difficult phase. That's how he framed it to Sarah, and that's how the rest of the Mitchell family saw it too. Jake was being difficult, going through something, acting out because of the divorce. Children needed stability, routine, strong male role models. David was offering all of these things, and Sarah's reluctance to accept his help was starting to look like ingratitude. "That boy needs discipline," Sarah's mother would say during their weekly phone calls. "David is trying to help, and you're letting Jake walk all over both of you. What kind of message does that send?" The message it sent was one of survival, though Sarah couldn't have articulated it that way at the time. Jake had developed an internal alarm system that activated whenever David was near, and Sarah had learned to trust it, even when she didn't understand it. She would make excuses, change plans, create elaborate workarounds to minimize their contact. It exhausted her, but the alternative seemed worse. What she didn't know was that Jake was documenting everything. The notebook under his mattress had grown thicker over the months, filled with entries written in his improving handwriting. He wrote about the dreams that woke him up screaming, about the way certain sounds made his stomach hurt, about the things Uncle David had said that made him feel dirty and ashamed. He wrote because he couldn't speak, and he couldn't speak because the words felt too big and too dangerous for his small voice. The summer Jake turned 7 was when the pattern truly established itself. David had offered to take Jake camping, a generous gesture that any normal uncle might make for his nephew. But when Sarah mentioned it to Jake, the boy's reaction was immediate and visceral. He vomited right there at the breakfast table, his small body shaking with a fear so profound it seemed to fill the room. "I can't," he whispered between dry heaves. "Please don't make me go. Please, Mommy. I'll be good. I'll do anything. Just don't make me go." Sarah held him while he sobbed, her own heart breaking at the desperation in his voice. When David called later to confirm the camping plans, she told him Jake had come down with a stomach bug. "Again?" David's voice carried a note of frustration. "Sarah, this is the 3rd time this month Jake's gotten sick when we've made plans. Maybe you should take him to see someone. This isn't normal." He was right, of course. It wasn't normal. But Sarah was beginning to understand that normal had left their lives sometime around Jake's 6th birthday, and she wasn't sure it was ever coming back. That autumn, something changed in the dynamic between David and the family. Where once he had been patient and understanding about Jake's behavior, now there was an edge to his interactions, a subtle pressure that made Sarah uncomfortable. He began showing up unannounced, claiming he was just in the neighborhood or had brought something for Jake. These visits always left her son withdrawn and anxious, though David's behavior seemed perfectly innocent to any outside observer. "I'm worried about that boy," David would tell other family members. "Sarah's coddling him, letting him dictate the family dynamics. He needs structure, needs someone to show him how to be a man." The words stung because part of Sarah wondered if they were true. Was she enabling Jake's fears? Was she preventing him from working through whatever psychological issue was causing his behavior? The doubt crept in during her sleepless nights, when she lay awake wondering if she was failing her son by protecting him from something that might be helping him. But then she would remember the look in Jake's eyes when David was around, the way her normally articulate child became mute and trembling. Whatever was happening wasn't a phase or a psychological block that needed to be pushed through. It was something deeper, something that had roots in a truth she wasn't ready to face. Jake's 8th birthday came and went, with another small celebration, another expensive gift from David that Jake refused to touch, another evening of her son crying himself to sleep. The pattern had become so established that Sarah barely questioned it anymore. This was their life now. Careful navigation around an uncle who seemed to love Jake, but whose presence terrified the child beyond reason. It was around this time that Sarah began having the dreams. They started as vague unease, shadowy figures in peripheral vision, but gradually became more specific. She would dream of Jake as a younger child, crying out for help, while she searched frantically through rooms that seemed to shift and change around her. She would wake up gasping, her heart pounding with the absolute certainty that something terrible had happened or was happening to her son. "Maybe you should talk to someone," her friend Linda suggested after Sarah confided about the nightmares. "You're carrying a lot of stress trying to manage Jake's issues on your own." But Sarah wasn't managing Jake's issues. She was managing around them, creating a protective barrier between her son and something she couldn't name. The distinction felt important, though she couldn't explain why. Spring of Jake's 9th year brought new challenges. Jake was old enough now to recognize his own isolation, to understand that his fear of his uncle was affecting more than just their family dynamic. Other kids at school had uncles they loved, uncles who took them fishing and played catch in the backyard. Jake had an uncle who made him feel sick and scared, and he was starting to believe there was something wrong with him for feeling that way. The notebook under his mattress grew thicker still. Now it contained not just records of David's visits and Jake's reactions, but his attempts to understand what was happening to him. He wrote questions he couldn't ask anyone. Why did Uncle David's voice make his skin crawl? Why did certain words make him want to hide? Why did he have dreams that felt more like memories, fragments of things that seemed real but couldn't possibly have happened? Sarah found the notebook by accident that May, while cleaning Jake's room. She had pulled his mattress aside to retrieve a toy that had fallen behind the bed, and there it was, a thick composition book, its cover worn from handling, filled with her son's careful handwriting. Her hands shook as she opened it. The first entry was dated just after Jake's 6th birthday party, written in the shaky letters of a child just learning to express complex thoughts on paper. As she read, the room seemed to grow cold around her. Entry after entry detailed encounters with David, but they were written from the perspective of a child who had experienced things no child should experience, who was trying to process trauma without the vocabulary or understanding to name it properly. The entries were cryptic, written in the careful language of a child who knew he was documenting something dangerous, but didn't know how to be direct about it. References to the game Uncle David likes to play, to the secret room where we're not supposed to tell anyone what happens, to the way he looks at me that makes me feel scared and yucky. Sarah's hands were trembling so badly she could barely turn the pages. With each entry, the picture became clearer and more horrifying. Jake hadn't been going through a phase or struggling with adjustment issues. He had been protecting himself from someone who had hurt him, someone who was still trying to hurt him, someone Sarah had trusted completely. The notebook slipped from her hands and fell to the floor, pages scattering. As she knelt to gather them up, one entry caught her eye. It was more recent, written in Jake's improved handwriting from just a few weeks earlier. "Mum doesn't know, and I can't tell her because it would make her too sad. Uncle David says it's our special secret, and if I tell anyone, bad things will happen to Mum. I don't want bad things to happen to Mum, so I keep the secret. But sometimes I write it down because holding it inside makes my chest hurt so bad I can't breathe. I wish I could tell her, but I can't. I love her too much to make her sad." Sarah sat on her son's bedroom floor, surrounded by scattered pages of a childhood destroyed, and wept. For the first time in 3 years, she understood why Jake couldn't speak. He wasn't protecting himself from David. He was protecting her. The realization hit her with the force of a physical blow. Her brother, the man she had trusted with her child's well-being, the pillar of their community, had been abusing her son, and Jake, in his innocent wisdom, had chosen to carry that burden alone rather than break his mother's heart with the truth. Sarah gathered up every page, every painful word her son had written, and held them against her chest. She understood now why Jake's fear had seemed so absolute, why her maternal instincts had screamed warnings she couldn't interpret. Her child had been crying out for help in the only way he knew how, and she had been too blind to see it. But she could see it now, and seeing it changed everything. As she sat there in the fading afternoon light, Sarah made a decision that would alter the course of their lives forever. She was going to confront David. She was going to get the truth, no matter how much it destroyed her to hear it. And she was going to make sure he never had the opportunity to hurt Jake or any other child ever again. What she didn't know was that across town, in a backyard that had once belonged to the Henderson family, there was another notebook buried in the ground. A notebook that would prove Jake wasn't David's first victim, and that the truth was even more devastating than anything she could imagine. The years that followed Jake's 6th birthday party became a careful dance of avoidance and pretense. Sarah learned to read the signs in her son's face. The subtle shift in his posture, when David's name was mentioned, the way his breathing would change when they drove past his uncle's house. She began scheduling their lives around Jake's unspoken fears, making excuses for missed family gatherings, declining invitations that would put them in David's presence for extended periods. But David was persistent. He was family, after all, and family doesn't just disappear because a child goes through a difficult phase. That's how he framed it to Sarah, and that's how the rest of the Mitchell family saw it too. Jake was being difficult, going through something, acting out because of the divorce. Children needed stability, routine, strong male role models. David was offering all of these things, and Sarah's reluctance to accept his help was starting to look like ingratitude. "That boy needs discipline," Sarah's mother would say during their weekly phone calls. "David is trying to help, and you're letting Jake walk all over both of you. What kind of message does that send?" The message it sent was one of survival, though Sarah couldn't have articulated it that way at the time. Jake had developed an internal alarm system that activated whenever David was near, and Sarah had learned to trust it even when she didn't understand it. She would make excuses, change plans, create elaborate workarounds to minimize their contact. It exhausted her, but the alternative seemed worse. What she didn't know was that Jake was documenting everything. The notebook under his mattress had grown thicker over the months, filled with entries written in his improving handwriting. He wrote about the dreams that woke him up screaming, about the way certain sounds made his stomach hurt, about the things Uncle David had said that made him feel dirty and ashamed. He wrote because he couldn't speak, and he couldn't speak because the words felt too big and too dangerous for his small voice. The summer Jake turned 7 was when the pattern truly established itself. David had offered to take Jake camping, a generous gesture that any normal uncle might make for his nephew. But when Sarah mentioned it to Jake, the boy's reaction was immediate and visceral. He vomited right there at the breakfast table, his small body shaking with a fear so profound it seemed to fill the room. "I can't," he whispered between dry heaves. "Please don't make me go. Please, Mommy. I'll be good. I'll do anything. Just don't make me go." Sarah held him while he sobbed, her own heart breaking at the desperation in his voice. When David called later to confirm the camping plans, she told him Jake had come down with a stomach bug. "Again?" David's voice carried a note of frustration. "Sarah, this is the 3rd time this month Jake's gotten sick when we've made plans. Maybe you should take him to see someone. This isn't normal." He was right, of course. It wasn't normal. But Sarah was beginning to understand that normal had left their lives sometime around Jake's 6th birthday, and she wasn't sure it was ever coming back. That autumn, something changed in the dynamic between David and the family. Where once he had been patient and understanding about Jake's behavior, now there was an edge to his interactions, a subtle pressure that made Sarah uncomfortable. He began showing up unannounced, claiming he was just in the neighborhood or had brought something for Jake. These visits always left her son withdrawn and anxious, though David's behavior seemed perfectly innocent to any outside observer. "I'm worried about that boy," David would tell other family members. "Sarah's coddling him, letting him dictate the family dynamics. He needs structure, needs someone to show him how to be a man." The words stung because part of Sarah wondered if they were true. Was she enabling Jake's fears? Was she preventing him from working through whatever psychological issue was causing his behavior? The doubt crept in during her sleepless nights, when she lay awake wondering if she was failing her son by protecting him from something that might be helping him. But then she would remember the look in Jake's eyes when David was around, the way her normally articulate child became mute and trembling. Whatever was happening wasn't a phase or a psychological block that needed to be pushed through. It was something deeper, something that had roots in a truth she wasn't ready to face. Jake's 8th birthday came and went, with another small celebration, another expensive gift from David that Jake refused to touch, another evening of her son crying himself to sleep. The pattern had become so established that Sarah barely questioned it anymore. This was their life now, careful navigation around an uncle who seemed to love Jake, but whose presence terrified the child beyond reason. It was around this time that Sarah began having the dreams. They started as vague unease, shadowy figures in peripheral vision, but gradually became more specific. She would dream of Jake as a younger child, crying out for help, while she searched frantically through rooms that seemed to shift and change around her. She would wake up gasping, her heart pounding with the absolute certainty that something terrible had happened or was happening to her son. "Maybe you should talk to someone," her friend Linda suggested after Sarah confided about the nightmares. You're carrying a lot of stress trying to manage Jake's issues on your own." But Sarah wasn't managing Jake's issues. She was managing around them, creating a protective barrier between her son and something she couldn't name. The distinction felt important, though she couldn't explain why. Spring of Jake's 9th year brought new challenges. Jake was old enough now to recognize his own isolation, to understand that his fear of his uncle was affecting more than just their family dynamic. Other kids at school had uncles they loved, uncles who took them fishing and played catch in the backyard. Jake had an uncle who made him feel sick and scared, and he was starting to believe there was something wrong with him for feeling that way. The notebook under his mattress grew thicker still. Now it contained not just records of David's visits and Jake's reactions, but his attempts to understand what was happening to him. He wrote questions he couldn't ask anyone. Why did Uncle David's voice make his skin crawl? Why did certain words make him want to hide? Why did he have dreams that felt more like memories, fragments of things that seemed real but couldn't possibly have happened? Sarah found the notebook by accident that May, while cleaning Jake's room. She had pulled his mattress aside to retrieve a toy that had fallen behind the bed, and there it was, a thick composition book, its cover worn from handling, filled with her son's careful handwriting. Her hands shook as she opened it. The first entry was dated just after Jake's 6th birthday party, written in the shaky letters of a child, just learning to express complex thoughts on paper. As she read, the room seemed to grow cold around her. Entry after entry detailed encounters with David, but they were written from the perspective of a child who had experienced things no child should experience, who was trying to process trauma without the vocabulary or understanding to name it properly. The entries were cryptic, written in the careful language of a child who knew he was documenting something dangerous, but didn't know how to be direct about it. References to the game Uncle David likes to play, to the secret room where we're not supposed to tell anyone what happens, to the way he looks at me that makes me feel scared and yucky. Sarah's hands were trembling so badly she could barely turn the pages. With each entry, the picture became clearer and more horrifying. Jake hadn't been going through a phase or struggling with adjustment issues. He had been protecting himself from someone who had hurt him, someone who was still trying to hurt him, someone Sarah had trusted completely. The notebook slipped from her hands and fell to the floor, pages scattering. As she knelt to gather them up, one entry caught her eye. It was more recent, written in Jake's improved handwriting from just a few weeks earlier. "Mum doesn't know, and I can't tell her because it would make her too sad. Uncle David says it's our special secret, and if I tell anyone, bad things will happen to Mum. I don't want bad things to happen to Mum, so I keep the secret. But sometimes I write it down because holding it inside makes my chest hurt so bad I can't breathe. I wish I could tell her, but I can't. I love her too much to make her sad." Sarah sat on her son's bedroom floor, surrounded by scattered pages of a childhood destroyed, and wept. For the first time in 3 years, she understood why Jake couldn't speak. He wasn't protecting himself from David. He was protecting her. The realization hit her with the force of a physical blow. Her brother, the man she had trusted with her child's well-being, the pillar of their community, had been abusing her son, and Jake, in his innocent wisdom, had chosen to carry that burden alone rather than break his mother's heart with the truth. Sarah gathered up every page, every painful word her son had written, and held them against her chest. She understood now why Jake's fear had seemed so absolute, why her maternal instincts had screamed warnings she couldn't interpret. Her child had been crying out for help in the only way he knew how, and she had been too blind to see it. But she could see it now, and seeing it changed everything. As she sat there in the fading afternoon light, Sarah made a decision that would alter the course of their lives forever. She was going to confront David. She was going to get the truth, no matter how much it destroyed her to hear it. And she was going to make sure he never had the opportunity to hurt Jake or any other child ever again. What she didn't know was that across town, in a backyard that had once belonged to the Henderson family, there was another notebook buried in the ground. A notebook that would prove Jake wasn't David's first victim, and that the truth was even more devastating than anything she could imagine. The confrontation Sarah had planned never happened the way she imagined it would. For 3 days after finding Jake's notebook, she carried the weight of that knowledge like a stone in her chest, rehearsing conversations that seemed impossible to have. How do you ask your brother if he's been molesting your child? How do you prepare for an answer that will destroy everything you thought you knew about your family? She watched Jake differently now. Seeing the careful way he moved through their daily routines, the hypervigilance in his eyes when the phone rang, the way he positioned himself near exits when they were in public. Her 9-year-old son had been living like a prisoner of war, and she had been his unwitting guard. The opportunity came on a Thursday evening when David showed up unannounced, as had become his habit. Sarah heard his truck in the driveway and felt Jake's entire body tense beside her on the couch where they had been reading together. Without thinking, she put her arm around her son and pulled him closer. "Go to your room, sweetheart," she said softly. "Take your book with you." Jake looked at her with surprise. Usually she would insist he come downstairs to greet his uncle, would make him endure the awkward small talk and forced affection. But something in her voice must have told him things were different now, because he nodded and disappeared upstairs without argument. David entered through the back door without knocking, another habit that had always annoyed Sarah, but which she had tolerated because he was family. Tonight, watching him move through her kitchen like he owned it, the presumption felt like a violation. "Where's the birthday boy?" David asked, settling into his usual chair at the kitchen table. Jake's 10th birthday was still 2 months away, but David had been referring to him as the birthday boy for weeks, a term of endearment that now made Sarah's skin crawl. "He's upstairs doing homework," Sarah said, remaining standing. She had imagined this moment dozens of times, but now that it was here, the words felt impossible to form. "I brought him something," David said, pulling a small wrapped package from his jacket pocket. "New baseball cards, the ones he's been wanting." Sarah stared at the gift, thinking of all the presents Jake had refused to touch, all the offerings her son had rejected without explanation. She had always assumed Jake was being ungrateful, but now she understood. Every gift was a reminder, every kind gesture a threat disguised as affection. "David, we need to talk," she said, her voice steadier than she felt. Something in her tone made David look up sharply. "Everything okay? You seem tense." Sarah pulled Jake's notebook from behind her back, where she had been hiding it since he walked in. She set it on the table between them and watched David's face carefully. For just a moment, she saw something flicker in his expression. Recognition, fear. Then it was gone, replaced by confusion. "What's this?" he asked, but his voice was different now. "Careful. Jake's been writing," Sarah said. "About you. About the things you've done to him." The silence that followed was deafening. David stared at the notebook without touching it, his face a mask of confusion that didn't quite reach his eyes. "Sarah, what are you talking about? What things?" "Don't," she said, her voice breaking. "Don't lie to me. Not about this. Not about my son." David opened the notebook, his movements slow and deliberate. Sarah watched him read the first few entries, saw the way his jaw tightened, the way his hands clenched around the pages. "This is fantasy," he said finally. "Kids' imagination running wild. You know how children are. They make up stories, they—" "Stop." Sarah's voice cut through his explanation like a blade. "I've watched you with him for years. I've seen the way he reacts to you, the way he changes when you're around. I've seen the fear in his eyes, David. Real fear." David closed the notebook and pushed it back toward her. "He's a troubled kid, Sarah. Has been since the divorce. He needs help. Professional help. This fantasy about me, it's probably some kind of psychological projection." "He was 5 years old when it started," Sarah interrupted. 5, David. What kind of 5-year-old makes up detailed stories about sexual abuse?" The words hung in the air between them, ugly and undeniable. David's face went pale, then flushed red. "You're accusing me of—" He couldn't finish the sentence, couldn't say the words out loud. "I'm not accusing you of anything. I'm telling you what my son wrote in his own words. I'm telling you what I should have seen years ago if I hadn't been so blind, so trusting, so desperate to believe that the people I love couldn't be capable of—" She couldn't finish either. The reality was too big, too monstrous to name completely. David stood up abruptly, his chair scraping against the floor. "I don't have to listen to this. I don't have to sit here and be accused of something so sick, so twisted. That boy has problems, Sarah. Serious problems. And if you can't see that, if you're going to believe his fantasies over the word of your own brother, get out," Sarah said quietly. "What?" "Get out of my house. Stay away from my son. Stay away from both of us." David's expression shifted, and for a moment, Sarah saw something that chilled her to the bone. It wasn't the hurt confusion of an innocent man being falsely accused. It was calculation, cold, careful calculation. "You're making a mistake," he said slowly. "A big mistake. Jake needs stability, needs male guidance. You're a single mother, Sarah. You can't do this alone, and if you try to spread these lies, these sick fantasies of a disturbed child, who do you think people are going to believe? The respected businessman who's been nothing but helpful to his struggling sister? Or the bitter divorced woman who's obviously projecting her own issues onto her son?" The threat was subtle but unmistakable. Sarah felt her legs go weak, but she forced herself to remain standing. "I said, get out." David picked up his jacket, moving with deliberate slowness. "I love that boy," he said as he reached the door. "I've only ever wanted what's best for him. And what's best for him is getting the help he needs, not feeding into his delusions." After he left, Sarah locked the door and leaned against it, her entire body shaking. She had confronted him. She had spoken the truth out loud. But instead of relief, she felt only a deeper, more complicated fear. David's reaction hadn't been that of an innocent man. It had been that of someone who had been preparing for this moment, someone who had contingency plans and strategies for deflecting suspicion. She found Jake sitting at the top of the stairs, his face pale and strained. He had heard everything. "I'm sorry, Mom," he whispered. "I'm sorry you had to know." Sarah climbed the stairs and pulled her son into her arms, holding him with a fierceness that surprised them both. "You have nothing to be sorry for," she said into his hair. "Nothing. Do you understand me? None of this is your fault." That night, Sarah called in sick to work and sat beside Jake's bed until he fell asleep. She watched him in the darkness, this brave little boy who had protected her from the truth for so long, and made another decision. She was going to find out everything. She was going to discover how long this had been going on, how many times it had happened, whether there were other victims. She was going to build a case that couldn't be dismissed as the fantasies of a troubled child. What she didn't know was that the evidence she needed was already waiting to be found. Just 3 miles away, in a backyard that had been abandoned for over a decade, another child's words lay buried in the earth. Words that would prove Jake's story wasn't fantasy or projection or the imagination of a disturbed mind. Words that would prove David Mitchell had been hunting children for far longer than anyone had imagined. The next morning, Sarah began her investigation. She started with phone calls to other families in town, casual conversations about their children's experiences with Uncle David. She asked careful questions about sleepovers and camping trips, about times when David had volunteered to babysit or help with childcare. What she found made her blood run cold. There were patterns. Children who had suddenly become withdrawn after spending time with David. Kids who had developed inexplicable fears or behavioral problems. Parents who had been puzzled by their children's reluctance to be around the man everyone considered a pillar of the community. But most disturbing of all were the families who had moved away suddenly, quietly, without explanation. The Hendersons, who had lived just a few blocks away until their 10-year-old son Tommy had some kind of breakdown, and they had packed up and left town overnight. The Williams family, whose daughter had been in Jake's class until they had relocated to another state, claiming it was for work, but leaving behind a successful business. The Pattersons, who had been active in the community until their twin boys had started having nightmares so severe they couldn't sleep, and then the family had simply disappeared. Sarah began to understand that Jake wasn't David's first victim. He might not even be his most recent. Her brother had been preying on children for years, and families had been dealing with the aftermath in silence, moving away rather than confronting what seemed impossible to prove. But Jake had done something none of the other children had done. He had kept a record. He had documented everything with the meticulous care of someone who understood, even as a small child, that his words might someday be the only evidence of crimes that left no physical trace. As Sarah read through the notebook again, she began to see references that hadn't made sense before. Mentions of the place where we meet, and the room with the old toys, and where the other kid used to go. Jake had been writing about a location, somewhere David took him that wasn't his house or Sarah's house, somewhere private and hidden where David felt safe to do the things he couldn't do anywhere else. Sarah thought about the Henderson house, abandoned since the family's sudden departure. She thought about the other empty properties David's construction business had access to, the rental houses and renovation projects that would provide perfect isolation for someone with David's intentions. She was going to find that place. She was going to find the evidence that would make David's crimes undeniable, and she was going to make sure he never had the opportunity to hurt another child. What she couldn't have known was that when she found David's secret place, she would discover something that would change everything she thought she understood about her brother's crimes. Something that would make her realize that the truth was far worse than even Jake's careful documentation had revealed. The search for David's secret location consumed Sarah's every waking moment. She drove through Millfield's quiet streets with new eyes, studying every empty house, every construction site, every property that David's business might have had access to over the years. She made lists of addresses, cross-referenced them with dates from Jake's notebook, and began to see a pattern that made her stomach turn. The Henderson house kept drawing her attention. It had been empty for 3 years now, ever since the family had packed up and left town with no forwarding address. The property was in foreclosure limbo, the yard overgrown, the windows dark and unwelcoming. David's construction company had done work on the house just months before the Hendersons' sudden departure. Sarah remembered him mentioning it at family dinners, complaining about how the job had gone over budget and schedule. But what if it hadn't been about construction delays? What if David had found other reasons to spend time at the Henderson property? Sarah parked across the street from the abandoned house on a grey October afternoon, 3 weeks after her confrontation with David. Jake was at school, safe in an environment where David couldn't reach him. She had been walking him to the building every morning and picking him up every afternoon, never leaving him alone, never giving David an opportunity to approach him. The Henderson house looked innocent enough from the outside. 2 stories, white siding that was now stained and peeling, a wraparound porch that had once been charming, but was now sagging and overgrown with weeds. But as Sarah studied it, she noticed something that made her pulse quicken. There was a basement window that was boarded up differently from the others. Newer wood that didn't match the weathered plywood covering the rest of the foundation. Fresh repairs, recent work, the kind of modifications someone might make if they needed to secure a space for purposes that required absolute privacy. Sarah's hands shook as she called Jake's school, confirming that he was safely in his classroom and would remain there until she picked him up. Then she called her friend Linda. "I need you to do something for me," Sarah said without preamble. "I need you to drive by the Henderson place on Maple Street every hour until I call you back. If you see David's truck, if you see any sign of him, call me immediately." "Sarah, what's going on? You sound—" "Please, Linda, just do this for me. I'll explain later." Sarah ended the call and stared at the house. She knew she should call the police, should involve professionals who were trained to handle situations like this. But she also knew what David had said about who people would believe, the respected businessman versus the hysterical single mother with a troubled child. She needed proof, something concrete and undeniable. The back door of the Henderson house was secured with a padlock that looked new, but the basement door leading out to the backyard was simply boarded over. Sarah found a loose piece of plywood and managed to pry it away from the frame enough to squeeze through. The basement was dark and musty, filled with the smell of mold and something else she couldn't identify, something that made her gag and cover her nose with her sleeve. She used her phone's flashlight to navigate through the space, stepping carefully around debris and old furniture left behind by the Henderson family. It was in the back corner of the basement that she found it. A room that had been recently constructed, walls of new drywall that created a space separate from the rest of the basement. The door was secured with a deadbolt that could only be opened from the outside, trapping anyone who might be locked inside. Sarah's heart pounded as she turned the bolt and pushed the door open. The smell hit her immediately, stronger now. Not just mold and dampness, but something organic and wrong. Her phone's light revealed a space that had been furnished like a child's room, but a child's room designed by someone with sick intentions. There was a small bed with cartoon sheets, toys scattered on the floor, a television with a DVD player, but there were also restraints built into the bed frame, cameras mounted in the corners, and photographs pinned to one wall that made Sarah's legs give out completely. Children, dozens of them. Pictures taken in this very room, images that captured faces frozen in fear and confusion. Sarah recognized some of them from her investigation into David's past victims, Tommy Henderson, the Williams girl. Others she didn't know but whose terror was unmistakable in every photograph. And there in the center of the wall was a picture of Jake, her beautiful boy looking younger and more vulnerable than she had ever seen him, staring at the camera with eyes that held too much knowledge for his age. Sarah vomited right there on the basement floor, her body rejecting what her mind was being forced to process. When the retching stopped, she forced herself to look again, to document what she was seeing. to gather the evidence that would put David away forever. That's when she saw the notebook. It was sitting on a small desk in the corner, almost hidden behind a pile of children's clothes, a composition book identical to the one Jake had been keeping under his mattress. With trembling hands, Sarah opened it and began to read. The handwriting was different, younger, more uncertain than Jake's careful script. The first entry was dated 4 years earlier. "My name is Tommy Henderson, and I'm 8 years old. Uncle David says I have to write down everything that happens in the special room so I won't forget our games. He says if I write it down, he'll let me go home sooner." Sarah's vision blurred as she read entry after entry, page after page of a child's attempts to process experiences that no child should ever have. Tommy's notebook was different from Jake's. Where Jake had written to preserve evidence and make sense of his trauma, Tommy had been forced to write as part of his abuse. David had made him document his own victimization, had used the boy's words as another form of control. The final entry was dated just days before the Henderson family had disappeared from Millfield. "Uncle David says we have to stop playing our games because people are asking questions. He says if I ever tell anyone about the special room or the games we played, something bad will happen to my mom and dad. He says he'll know if I tell because he's watching us all the time. I'm scared, but I won't tell. I don't want anything bad to happen to my family. Maybe someday when I'm bigger I'll be brave enough to tell someone, but not now. I'm too scared now." Sarah pressed the notebook to her chest and wept. Tommy Henderson had been just as brave as Jake, just as protective of his family, just as determined to carry his burden alone, rather than risk the people he loved. But Tommy had been younger, less articulate, more completely under David's control. Where Jake had found ways to resist and document, Tommy had been forced to participate in his own exploitation. She photographed every page of Tommy's notebook, every horrific image on the walls, every piece of evidence in that terrible room. Then she called 911. "I need to report child sexual abuse," she said when the dispatcher answered. "Multiple victims. I have evidence." Physical evidence. The police arrived within minutes, followed by investigators and social workers, and people whose job it was to process scenes like the ones Sarah had discovered. She led them through the basement, watched their faces change as they understood what they were seeing, listened to their carefully professional language as they documented David's crimes. But even as the machinery of justice began to turn, Sarah knew that David was already gone. By the time the first police car had arrived at the Henderson house, Linda was calling to report that David's truck was no longer at his business, that his house appeared to be empty, that neighbors had seen him loading boxes into his vehicle early that morning. David had been watching, waiting, preparing for the moment when his carefully constructed life would collapse. He had contingency plans that went far beyond the casual threats he had made to Sarah. He had escape routes and hidden resources, and the kind of preparation that spoke to years of anticipating this day. "We'll find him," Detective Martinez assured Sarah as they stood in the basement that had been converted into a chamber of horrors. "We have his picture, his vehicle information, his financial records. He can't just disappear." But Sarah knew better. David had been disappearing children for years, making families vanish without a trace, operating in plain sight while maintaining a facade of respectability. If anyone knew how to disappear completely, it was someone who had been making others disappear for so long. That evening, Sarah sat in her living room with Jake, holding him close while he cried for Tommy Henderson and the other children whose faces had been on that wall. Jake had been carrying the knowledge that there were other victims, but he had never known their names or faces until today. "I should have been braver," he whispered against her shoulder. "I should have told someone sooner." "You were the bravest person I know," Sarah told him. "You survived. You kept records. You made it possible for us to find the truth and help the other children. You saved lives by staying strong." But even as she comforted her son, Sarah's mind was racing. The police had found evidence of multiple victims, but they had only recovered one notebook besides Jake's. Where were the records of the other children? Where were their voices, their testimonies, their proof that David's crimes extended far beyond what they had already discovered? And more importantly, where was David now? Was he already hunting new victims in a new town, building new secret rooms, continuing the cycle of abuse that had defined his life for so many years? Sarah was about to discover that the answer to both questions lay buried in her own backyard. waiting in the earth like a time bomb set to explode everything she thought she knew about the scope of David's crimes. The notebook that Jake would eventually unearth on his 18th birthday wasn't just evidence of another victim. It was proof that David's predation had roots that went deeper and darker than anyone had imagined, and that the children he had hurt were connected by more than just their shared trauma. But that revelation was still years away. For now, there was only the beginning of justice, the slow process of healing, and the terrible knowledge that somewhere out there, David Mitchell was free and dangerous, and possibly already choosing his next victim. The manhunt for David Mitchell consumed Millfield for months. His photograph appeared on every news station within a 100-mile radius, his face plastered on wanted posters in truck stops and gas stations across 3 states. The FBI became involved when evidence suggested he had crossed state lines, and suddenly the quiet Ohio town found itself at the center of a federal investigation that would reshape how people thought about the monsters who lived among them. But David had vanished as completely as if he had never existed. His bank accounts were emptied, his house was abandoned, and his construction business was left to collapse under the weight of cancelled contracts and police investigation. It was as if he had been planning his disappearance for years, waiting for the moment when his carefully constructed life would finally crumble. Sarah found herself thrust into a spotlight she had never wanted. Reporters called at all hours, wanting to know how she had missed the signs, how a mother could have been so blind to her brother's crimes. The questions felt like accusations, each interview a fresh wound in her already battered sense of self. She had trusted David completely, had allowed him access to her child, had ignored her son's obvious distress for years. The guilt was eating her alive. "You couldn't have known," Detective Martinez told her during one of their regular check-ins. He was careful, manipulative. He knew exactly how to present himself to avoid suspicion. "You're not the first family member to be fooled by someone like this." But the reassurances felt hollow. Sarah lay awake at night, replaying every interaction, every missed opportunity to see the truth, every moment when she had chosen to believe David's explanations rather than trust her son's fear. The what-ifs consumed her thoughts like a fever. Jake was struggling too, though in different ways. The revelation that there had been other victims brought him both relief and guilt. Relief that he hadn't been alone in his suffering. Guilt that his silence might have allowed David to hurt other children. He started having nightmares again, dreams where he was back in that basement room with Tommy Henderson and the other faces from the photographs, all of them crying for help, while Jake stood frozen and unable to speak. "It's normal," the trauma counselor assured Sarah. "Survivors often experience increased symptoms when they learn about other victims. Jake is processing not just his own trauma, but the weight of feeling responsible for others' pain. It will take time." Time was something Sarah felt they were running out of. Every day that David remained free was another day he could be building new secret rooms, choosing new victims, continuing the cycle of abuse that had defined his life. The investigators assured her they were following every lead, tracking every potential sighting, but Sarah could see the frustration in their eyes. David Mitchell had simply disappeared. It was during this period of waiting and uncertainty that Sarah began to notice changes in their neighborhood. Subtle things at first. Cars driving slowly past their house, figures standing at the edge of their property line in the early morning darkness, phone calls that ended when she answered. She told herself it was paranoia, a natural result of the trauma they had all experienced. But then Jake started having the same feelings. "Someone's watching us," he told her one evening, as they sat at the kitchen table doing homework. "I can feel it when I'm at school too, like there are eyes on me all the time." Sarah wanted to dismiss it as hypervigilance, a common symptom of trauma, but she had learned to trust her son's instincts, and her own maternal radar was sending up warning signals she couldn't ignore. She began checking the locks on their doors obsessively, keeping the curtains drawn, avoiding their usual routines. The feeling of being watched intensified over the following weeks. Sarah found herself taking different routes to work, varying their schedules, looking over her shoulder constantly. She considered moving, leaving Millfield entirely, but the investigators had asked them to stay available in case David made contact or tried to return. "He might come back," Detective Martinez had explained. "Child predators often become obsessed with specific victims, especially ones who escaped their control. If David is still in the area, there's a chance he'll try to re-establish contact with Jake." The thought terrified Sarah, but it also gave her hope. If David did return, if he was foolish enough to come after Jake again, they would be ready for him. The police had set up surveillance, and Sarah had been trained to recognize the signs of David's presence. This time there would be no escape. But as autumn turned to winter, and winter gave way to spring, there was no sign of David Mitchell. The surveillance was eventually scaled back, the daily check-ins became weekly, and gradually the intensity of the investigation began to fade. Other cases demanded attention, other predators needed to be caught, and the resources dedicated to finding one man who had effectively vanished couldn't be maintained indefinitely. Sarah understood the reality, but she couldn't accept it. Every night when she tucked Jake into bed, she wondered if David was out there somewhere planning his return, waiting for their guard to drop. The uncertainty was almost worse than the abuse itself had been. At least then she had known what they were dealing with, even if she hadn't understood it fully. Jake's 10th birthday came and went without incident, then his 11th, his 12th. They developed new routines, new ways of living that took their changed reality into account. Jake continued his therapy, slowly learning to process his trauma and guilt. Sarah threw herself into advocacy work, connecting with other families who had been affected by similar crimes, trying to turn their pain into something useful. But they were still prisoners of David's legacy, still looking over their shoulders, still jumping at unexpected sounds, still carrying the knowledge that somewhere out there, a dangerous man was free and possibly hurting other children. The weight of that knowledge was crushing, but it was also what kept them vigilant. As Jake entered his teenage years, he began asking different questions about David's disappearance. Where could he have gone? How was he supporting himself? Was he using a different name, a different identity? Jake had inherited his mother's need to understand, to piece together the puzzle of David's crimes and escape. Maybe he's dead, Jake suggested one evening when he was 14. Maybe he had an accident or got sick or someone killed him. Maybe that's why no one can find him. Sarah wanted to believe it was that simple, but she knew better. David had been too careful, too prepared, too skilled at manipulation and deception to simply die anonymously somewhere. If he was dead, there would be evidence. If he was alive, there would be traces. The complete absence of either suggested something more disturbing, that David Mitchell had successfully transformed himself into someone else entirely. It was around this time that Sarah began receiving letters. They arrived sporadically with no return address, postmarked from different cities across the country. The messages were brief and seemingly innocent. Hope you and Jake are doing well. Thinking of you during this difficult time. Family is forever no matter what happens. The investigators analyzed the letters, looking for fingerprints, DNA, anything that could tie them definitively to David. But the results were always inconclusive. The handwriting was carefully disguised. The paper and ink were common brands available anywhere, and there were no forensic markers that could provide a solid lead. But Sarah knew. She knew with the absolute certainty of someone who had lived with a predator, who had seen the careful way David planned and executed his manipulations. The letters were from him, gentle reminders that he was still out there, still watching, still part of their lives whether they wanted him to be or not. "He's playing with us," Jake said after reading the latest letter. He was 16 now, tall and strong and angry in a way that broke Sarah's heart. "He wants us to know he's out there, but he's not ready to come back yet. He's waiting for something." "Waiting for what?" Sarah asked, though she was afraid she already knew the answer. "For me to turn 18, Jake said quietly. "For me to be legally an adult. When the statute of limitations starts running out on some of his crimes, when he thinks I might be more vulnerable, more likely to keep quiet to protect you." The thought chilled Sarah to the bone, but it made terrible sense. David had always been a long-term planner, someone who thought years ahead of his actions. If he was biding his time, waiting for the right moment to resurface, Jake's 18th birthday would be symbolically perfect. The boy who had escaped his control would finally be a man, and David would want to test whether that man was as easily manipulated as the child had been. As Jake's 18th birthday approached, Sarah found herself torn between hope and terror. Hope that David might finally reveal himself, giving the authorities a chance to capture him. Terror that her son might be walking into a trap that had been 18 years in the making. What she couldn't have known was that Jake had been preparing for this moment too. On the morning of his 18th birthday, he would do something that would finally give them the evidence they needed to understand the full scope of David's crimes, something that would reveal that the monster they had been hunting was even more dangerous than they had imagined. The notebook buried in their backyard wasn't just evidence of another victim. It was the key to understanding how David Mitchell had operated for decades, how many children he had hurt, and why he had chosen their family as his final target. When Jake dug it up and handed it to his mother, everything they thought they knew about David's crimes would change forever. But that revelation was still months away. For now there was only the waiting, the watching, and the growing certainty that David Mitchell's story was far from over. Jake's 18th birthday dawned grey and cold, a late October morning that seemed to mirror the weight of expectations everyone was carrying. Sarah had barely slept, her mind racing with possibilities and fears. The police had increased their surveillance around the house, anticipating that David might choose this symbolic date to make contact. Detective Martinez sat in an unmarked car across the street, while other officers monitored from positions around the neighborhood. But Jake seemed strangely calm as he came downstairs that morning. There was something different about him, a sense of purpose that Sarah hadn't seen before. He moved through their morning routine with unusual deliberation, eating breakfast slowly, checking his phone repeatedly, glancing out the windows as if he was expecting something. "How are you feeling?" Sarah asked, studying her son's face for signs of anxiety or fear. "Ready?" Jake said simply. "I've been ready for this day for a long time." The words carried a weight that made Sarah's stomach tighten. "Ready for what, sweetheart?" Jake stood up from the table and walked to the kitchen window, looking out at their backyard. The garden Sarah had planted when they first moved to Millfield was overgrown now, wild and neglected in the years since David's disappearance had consumed their lives. But Jake's attention seemed focused on a specific spot near the back fence, an area where an old oak tree cast deep shadows even in daylight. "There's something I need to show you," he said quietly. "Something I should have told you years ago, but I wasn't ready. I wasn't strong enough." Sarah felt a chill run down her spine. "Jake, what are you talking about?" Instead of answering, Jake walked to the garage and returned with a shovel. Sarah followed him outside, her heart pounding as she watched him move with purpose toward the oak tree. Detective Martinez must have been watching too, because she saw him get out of his car and start walking toward their property. Jake stopped at a spot about 3 feet from the base of the tree and began to dig. The earth was soft from recent rain, and the shovel cut through it easily. Sarah wanted to ask him what he was doing, but something in his expression stopped her. This was something he needed to do, something he had been planning. After about 10 minutes of digging, the shovel hit something solid. Jake's face went pale, but he continued working, carefully clearing dirt away from whatever he had found. Slowly, a metal box emerged from the earth, old and corroded but still intact. "Jesus Christ," Detective Martinez said as he reached them. "Jake, what is this?" Jake pulled the box from the hole and set it on the ground. His hands were shaking now, the calm resolve finally cracking. "I buried this when I was 6, he said, "right after Uncle David told me what would happen if I ever told anyone about our games." Sarah knelt beside her son, staring at the box. "What's inside it?" "Evidence," Jake said simply. "Things I took from the basement room. Things I knew we'd need someday when I was brave enough to tell the truth." With trembling hands, Jake opened the box. Inside, wrapped in plastic bags that a 6-year-old had carefully sealed to protect them from moisture, were items that made Sarah's blood run cold. Photographs that David had dropped during one of their encounters. A piece of fabric, torn from a child's clothing. And at the bottom of the box, another notebook. But this notebook was different from the others they had found. The cover was marked with a name that made Sarah gasp. "Property of Michael Chen, age 7. Detective Martinez was already on his radio, calling for the crime scene unit, requesting additional investigators. But Sarah's attention was fixed on the notebook in Jake's hands. "I saw him bury this," Jake said quietly. "Uncle David. He thought I was asleep in the car, but I was watching. He dug a hole right here and buried this box, and I remembered where it was. After everything happened, after he disappeared, I came out here and dug it up. I knew someday we'd need proof of what he did to the other children." Sarah opened Michael Chen's notebook with hands that wouldn't stop shaking. The handwriting was even younger than Tommy Henderson's had been, shakier and less certain, but the content was devastatingly clear. Michael Chen had been documenting his abuse at David's hands, writing in the careful, frightened words of a 7-year-old, trying to make sense of experiences that no child should have. "Where is Michael Chen now?" Detective Martinez asked gently. Jake's face crumpled. "He's dead," he whispered. "Uncle David told me what happened to him. He said Michael tried to tell someone about their games, and bad things happened because of it. He said that's what would happen to me if I ever told anyone." The words hit Sarah like a physical blow. Michael Chen wasn't just another victim of David's abuse. He was a murder victim, a child who had tried to speak up and had paid the ultimate price for his courage. "Jake," Detective Martinez said carefully, "are you telling us that David killed Michael Chen?" "I don't know," Jake said, tears streaming down his face. "I was too little to understand everything he was telling me, but he said Michael was gone, that he couldn't hurt anyone anymore by telling lies. He said the same thing would happen to other kids if they tried to tell stories about games that were supposed to be secret." Sarah pulled her son into her arms, holding him while he sobbed out 18 years of terror and silence. She understood now why Jake had never been able to speak, why the fear had been so absolute and overwhelming. David hadn't just threatened him with abstract consequences. He had shown Jake what happened to children who tried to escape his control. The crime scene unit arrived within the hour, along with FBI agents and investigators from multiple jurisdictions. Sarah watched them carefully document the contents of the box, photograph every page of Michael Chen's notebook, and begin the process of expanding their investigation into what was now clearly a murder case. "This changes everything," Agent Walsh from the FBI explained to Sarah. "We're not just looking for a child molester anymore. We're looking for a killer, and with this evidence we have a much better chance of finding him." But even as the investigation intensified, Sarah couldn't shake the feeling that David was still one step ahead of them. He had known that Jake might eventually find the courage to speak, might eventually lead them to the evidence he had buried. Why hadn't he moved it? Why had he left such damning proof where it could be discovered? The answer came 3 days later, when Sarah found another letter in her mailbox. This one was different from the others, longer and more detailed, and unlike the previous letters, this one was signed. "Dear Sarah and Jake," it began. "By now you've found Michael's notebook, and you think you understand what kind of monster I am, but you're still missing the most important piece of the puzzle. Michael Chen wasn't my first victim, and Jake won't be my last. I've been doing this for 30 years, in towns across the country, and I've gotten very good at disappearing when things get too complicated. But Jake has always been special to me. He was so smart, so brave, so determined to protect you. I've been watching him grow up from a distance, waiting to see what kind of man he would become. And now that he's 18, now that he's finally found the courage to speak, I think it's time for us to have a proper reunion. I'll be in touch soon. There are things Jake needs to understand about his family, about why I chose you, about the connection between Michael Chen and the Mitchell family that goes back much further than you realize. The truth is going to hurt, Sarah, but the truth is also going to set us all free. Give my love to my favorite nephew. We have so much catching up to do. Uncle David." Sarah's hands were shaking so badly she could barely hold the letter. David wasn't just taunting them anymore. He was planning something, building towards some kind of confrontation that he had been orchestrating for years. And there was something else in the letter, something that made her blood freeze. David had referred to a connection between Michael Chen and the Mitchell family, something that went back further than they realized. What did that mean? How could a 7-year-old victim from decades ago be connected to their family? That night, Sarah called her mother for the first time in months. Their relationship had been strained since David's crimes had come to light, but Sarah needed answers about their family history that only her mother could provide. "Mom, I need to ask you about something," Sarah said without preamble. "Did we ever know a family named Chen? Maybe when David and I were children?" The silence on the other end of the line stretched too long. When her mother finally spoke, her voice was careful and guarded. "Why are you asking about that, Sarah?" "Because David mentioned them in a letter. He said there was a connection between Michael Chen and our family that goes back decades. What aren't you telling me?" Another long pause. Then her mother's voice, smaller and more fragile than Sarah had ever heard it. "Michael Chen was your cousin, your father's brother's child. He disappeared when he was 7 years old, and we never found out what happened to him. Your father made us promise never to talk about it, said it would only bring more pain to the family." The words hit Sarah like a landslide. Michael Chen hadn't been a random victim. He had been family. David had killed his own cousin, and then years later had targeted Jake, another child in the same family line. "Oh my God," Sarah whispered. David has been hunting our family for 30 years. The realization opened up possibilities too horrible to contemplate. How many other cousins, nephews, children connected to their family tree had David targeted over the decades? How long had he been planning Jake's abuse? And what did he mean when he said Jake needed to understand the truth about their family? Sarah was about to discover that David's letter had been more than just a taunt. It had been an invitation to the final act of a drama that had been playing out for 3 decades. And when David finally revealed himself, he would bring with him secrets that would shatter everything Sarah thought she knew about her family, her father, and the legacy of violence that had been passed down through generations of Mitchell men. The truth wasn't going to set them free. It was going to destroy them. The revelation that Michael Chen was family changed everything about the investigation. FBI agents pored over decades of missing persons reports, looking for other children connected to the Mitchell and Chen family trees who had disappeared under suspicious circumstances. What they found painted a picture of systematic predation that stretched back 30 years and across multiple states. There was David's cousin, Timothy, who had vanished during a family camping trip in 1985. Jennifer Mitchell, a distant relative who had disappeared from a playground in Pennsylvania in 1989. Kevin Chen, Michael's older brother, who had been found dead in a river 3 years before Michael's own disappearance. All of them children, all of them connected by blood to the Mitchell family, all of them potential victims of someone who had been hunting his own relatives for decades. It's not uncommon for predators to target children within their extended families, Agent Walsh explained to Sarah during one of their briefings. They have access, they're trusted, and they can use family loyalty to silence victims. But the scope of what David appears to have been doing is unprecedented. Sarah sat in the FBI field office, staring at photographs of children she had never known existed. Her family tree had been pruned by a monster, branches cut away by someone who should have been protecting them. The weight of it was crushing, but it also provided a horrible kind of clarity. He's been planning this his whole life, she said quietly. Jake wasn't just a target of opportunity. He was part of a pattern, part of something David has been building toward for 30 years. Agent Walsh nodded grimly. And now he's ready for the endgame. The letter suggests he's planning to make contact again, probably soon. We need to be ready for him. But being ready for David Mitchell was proving to be more complicated than anyone had anticipated. He had been preparing for this moment longer than they had been hunting him, and every move they made seemed to be something he had already anticipated. The surveillance around Sarah and Jake's house was increased, but David had demonstrated that he could watch them without being detected. Their phones were tapped, but he had never called them directly. Their mail was monitored, but his letters appeared to be delivered by methods that left no trace of how they had arrived. Jake was struggling with the new information about their family history. Learning that Michael Chen was his cousin, that David had been targeting their family for decades, had reopened wounds that had just begun to heal. I could have saved him, Jake said during one of his therapy sessions. If I had spoken up sooner, if I had been braver, maybe the police could have found Michael's body, could have connected the dots earlier. You were a child, Dr. Reynolds reminded him gently. You did what you had to do to survive. Michael's death isn't your responsibility any more than your abuse was your fault. But the guilt was eating at Jake in ways that worried Sarah. He had stopped sleeping, stopped eating regularly, started having panic attacks that left him gasping and shaking. The knowledge that David was out there planning something, combined with the weight of learning about the other victims, was taking a toll that no 18-year-old should have to bear. It was during this period of heightened tension that Sarah began having the dreams again, but these were different from the vague nightmares she had experienced before. These dreams were specific, detailed, filled with imagery that felt more like memories than imagination. She dreamed of her childhood home, of family gatherings where David had always been present, always helpful, always volunteering to watch the children while the adults talked. She dreamed of her father, stern and distant, having hushed conversations with David that stopped whenever she entered the room. She dreamed of other children at those gatherings, cousins and family friends who had seemed to vanish from their lives without explanation. The dreams were so vivid, so filled with details she was certain she had never consciously remembered, that Sarah began to wonder if they were really dreams at all. Had she witnessed something as a child? Had she seen David with one of his victims and blocked the memory out? Had her father known what David was doing and helped cover it up? The possibility that her father might have been complicit in David's crimes was too horrible to contemplate, but it would explain so much. Why David had felt safe to operate within the family for so long. Why certain relatives had simply disappeared from their lives without explanation. Why her father had always insisted that family business stayed within the family, no matter what. Sarah called her mother again, this time armed with specific questions about the family gatherings of her childhood. "Mom, I need you to think carefully about something. At those family reunions when I was little, were there ever children who came once and then never came back? Kids who just stopped being part of our family events?" Her mother's silence was answer enough. "Sarah, what are you trying to get at?" "I'm trying to understand how long David has been doing this, how many children he hurt, how many people in our family might have known and looked the other way." "Your father dealt with David's problems," her mother said finally, her voice barely above a whisper. "He said it was a family matter that we needed to handle it ourselves. He said involving outsiders would destroy all of us." The admission hit Sarah like a physical blow. Her father had known. He had known what David was doing to children in their family, and he had chosen to protect the family's reputation over the safety of innocent children. "What problems, Mom? What exactly did Dad know?" "I can't talk about this over the phone," her mother said. "If you want to know the truth, you need to come here. You need to see what your father left behind." Sarah made the drive to her mother's house the next day, leaving Jake under FBI protection. She found her mother in the basement, standing beside a filing cabinet that Sarah had never seen before. "Your father kept records," her mother said without preamble, "of David's victims, of the families they paid to stay quiet, of the places they moved the bodies." Sarah's legs gave out completely. She sank to the floor of the basement, staring at the filing cabinet that contained evidence of decades of covered-up crimes. "He was documenting it all," her mother continued. "Every child David hurt, every family that was paid off, every time they had to clean up David's messes. I think he was planning to turn David in eventually, but he died before he could decide how to do it without destroying our entire family." With shaking hands, Sarah opened the first drawer of the filing cabinet. Inside were folders organized by year, each one containing photographs, police reports, financial records, and handwritten notes in her father's careful script. It was a record of complicity that stretched back to David's teenage years, when he had first been caught abusing a neighbor child and the family had paid to keep it quiet. The scope of it was staggering. Dozens of children over 3 decades, families who had been paid to relocate and stay silent, bodies that had been moved and reburied, a network of corruption and cover-up that had allowed David to continue his crimes for far longer than should have been possible. And at the bottom of the last drawer, Sarah found something that made her blood freeze, a file labeled Jake Mitchell that contained photographs of her son taken from a distance, school records, medical information, and a detailed plan for what David had intended to do to him. The file was dated from 2001, when Jake was 13 years old. David had been planning Jake's abuse for 5 years before it began, watching him, studying him, preparing for the moment when he would become David's next victim. And Sarah's father had known about it. At the very bottom of Jake's file was a note in her father's handwriting. "This has to stop. I can't let him take another child. If I don't find the courage to stop this, I'll have to leave evidence for someone else to find." Sarah understood now why her father had kept such meticulous records. He had been building a case against David, documenting everything, so that someday someone would be able to stop him. But he had died before he could act on that evidence, leaving it hidden in a basement filing cabinet where it might never have been found. She called Agent Walsh immediately, her voice shaking as she explained what she had discovered. "We need a full forensics team," she said. "Everything my father documented needs to be processed as evidence. There are dozens of victims, Agent Walsh. Dozens of children who were never reported missing because their families were paid to stay quiet." But even as the FBI began processing the mountain of evidence her father had left behind, Sarah couldn't shake the feeling that they were still missing something crucial. David's letter had mentioned that there were things Jake needed to understand about his family. What could be worse than what they had already discovered? The answer came in the form of another letter, delivered to Sarah's mother's house while the FBI was processing her father's files. This letter was addressed specifically to Jake, and it contained an invitation that chilled Sarah to the bone. "My dear nephew," it began, "by now you've found your grandfather's insurance policy, and you understand that our family's secrets go deeper than you imagined. But there's one more truth you need to learn. One more piece of the puzzle that will help you understand why you were always so special to me. Meet me tomorrow night at the old quarry outside town. Come alone, and I'll tell you the truth about your father. The real truth about why your mother had to leave him, and why I was the only family member willing to help her start over. Don't disappoint me, Jake. After 18 years of waiting, I think we both deserve to have this conversation face to face. With love, Uncle David. Sarah stared at the letter, her mind reeling. David was claiming to know something about Jake's father, something that connected to why she had divorced him and moved to Millfield. But Jake's father had never been part of this story. He had been a different kind of problem entirely. A man whose drinking and gambling had made him an unreliable husband, but never a danger to their child. Or had he been? As Sarah read the letter again, she began to understand that David's endgame wasn't just about Jake. It was about revealing a truth that would shatter everything she thought she knew about her own life, her own choices, and the real reason she had brought her son into David's orbit in the first place. Tomorrow night at the quarry, Jake would learn the final piece of the puzzle, and Sarah was beginning to suspect that when he did, it would destroy what little remained of their world. The quarry had been abandoned for over 20 years, its dark water reflecting nothing but emptiness under the pale moon. Sarah sat in the FBI surveillance van, watching Jake walk toward the meeting point with a wire taped to his chest and Agent Walsh's voice in his earpiece. Every instinct she had as a mother screamed at her to stop this, to pull her son back to safety, but they all knew this might be their only chance to capture David. "Remember, Jake," Agent Walsh's voice crackled through the communications system, "you don't have to stay long. Get him talking, get him to admit to the crimes, and then we'll move in." But Sarah could see the tension in her son's shoulders as he approached the quarry's edge. This wasn't just about getting David to confess anymore. Jake needed to know the truth about his father, about the family secrets that had shaped his entire life. The curiosity that had kept him silent for 18 years was the same force driving him toward this confrontation now. David was waiting by the water, exactly as he had promised. He looked older, grayer, but still carried himself with the confident posture of someone who believed he was in control. Sarah's stomach clenched as she watched him embrace Jake, like a loving uncle greeting his favorite nephew. "You've grown up," David said, his voice carrying clearly across the water to the surveillance equipment. "You look just like your father did at your age." "What do you know about my father?" Jake asked, cutting straight to the heart of why he had come. David smiled, the same charming expression that had fooled Sarah for so many years. "Everything, Jake. I know why your mother really left him. I know what he was doing to you before she found the courage to run, and I know why she chose to move here, to my town, where I could keep you safe from him." Sarah felt the world tilt around her. Jake's father had never hurt him. She had left because of Mark's drinking and gambling, because he was irresponsible and unreliable, not because he was abusive. David was lying, manipulating Jake, just like he had manipulated everyone else. But Jake's response made her blood freeze. "I remember," Jake said quietly. "I remember the games he used to play, the way he would come into my room at night when Mom was working late shifts. I remember being scared and not understanding why." "No," Sarah whispered in the surveillance van. "That's not true. Mark never hurt Jake. He wouldn't have—" Agent Walsh grabbed her arm as she started to move toward the van door. "Sarah, we have to let this play out. If Jake is remembering something from before you moved to Millfield, we need to hear it." On the wire, David's voice continued, gentle and understanding. "Your mother never knew, did she? Mark was careful about that. He only played his games when she wasn't around. And when you tried to tell her, what did he say would happen?" "He said no one would believe me." Jake's voice was barely above a whisper. "He said if I told anyone, he would hurt Mum. He said it was our secret, and secrets were what made families strong." Sarah's mind was reeling. She was hearing about abuse that had happened before they moved to Millfield, before David had ever entered their lives. But if Mark had been abusing Jake, why hadn't she seen the signs? Why hadn't she protected her son? "So when your mother finally left him," David continued, "when she brought you here to start over, I knew what you had been through. I recognized the signs because I had been through something similar myself when I was your age, and I wanted to help you heal. By doing the same things to me that my father had done?" Jake's voice was stronger now, angry. David's expression didn't change. "I was teaching you that you were strong enough to survive it. I was showing you that you had control, that you could choose to keep secrets or tell them. Your father made you feel powerless. I was trying to give you your power back. Sarah wanted to vomit. David was justifying his abuse by claiming it was therapeutic, by suggesting that he had been helping Jake recover from previous trauma. It was the most twisted logic she had ever heard, but she could see how a confused child might have been manipulated into believing it. But it wasn't helping, Jake said. It was making everything worse. It was making me feel dirty and ashamed and scared all the time. Because you weren't ready yet, David replied patiently. You were still thinking like a victim instead of thinking like a survivor. That's why I had to wait. Why I had to give you time to grow up and understand what I was really offering you. Agent Walsh was speaking quietly into his radio, coordinating with the teams positioned around the quarry. But Sarah could barely hear him over the sound of her own heartbeat pounding in her ears. Her son was standing 20 feet away from a monster who had spent 18 years justifying his crimes, and she was powerless to protect him. What about Michael Chen? Jake asked suddenly. What about all the other children you hurt? Were you helping them too? For the first time, David's composure slipped slightly. Michael was different. Michael couldn't understand what I was trying to teach him. He kept fighting, kept trying to tell people about our games. He couldn't see that I was trying to make him stronger. So, you killed him. I defended myself, David said calmly. Michael attacked me with a kitchen knife during one of our sessions. I had to stop him before he hurt himself or someone else. His death was an accident, Jake. A tragedy that could have been avoided if he had just trusted me. Sarah could see Agent Walsh tensing in the van beside her. David had just confessed to murder on tape, but he had framed it as self-defense. A good lawyer might be able to create reasonable doubt, might be able to convince a jury that David had been the victim of a child's violent outburst. And my grandfather? Jake pressed. Did he know what you were doing to all those children? David's smile returned, cold and calculating. Your grandfather understood that family comes first. He understood that sometimes difficult decisions have to be made to protect the people we love. When families started asking questions, when police started sniffing around, your grandfather made sure those problems went away. By paying people off. By threatening them. By helping you cover up murders. By doing what needed to be done to keep our family safe, David corrected. Your grandfather was a practical man, Jake. He knew that destroying me would destroy everyone connected to me. Sarah would have been implicated in the cover-ups. Your grandmother would have lost her house, her reputation, everything she had worked for. Sometimes protecting the family means making sacrifices. Sarah understood now why her father had kept such detailed records. He hadn't been documenting David's crimes to help him cover them up. He had been building evidence for the day when the cover-ups would no longer be possible, when the truth would have to come out. He had been preparing for this moment, when someone would finally have the courage to stop David permanently. But you're not family, Jake said, his voice steady and clear. You're a predator who used family connections to hunt children. You're a killer who manipulated good people into helping you cover up your crimes. And you're done. David's expression darkened. You think you're brave now, Jake. You think 18 years of silence has made you strong enough to stand up to me. You're still that scared little boy who wet himself the first time I took him to the basement room. Maybe, Jake said. But I'm also the boy who kept records, who buried evidence, who spent 18 years planning for this moment just like you did. Sarah saw movement in the shadows around the quarry as the FBI teams began to close in, but David saw it too, and his hand moved to something concealed under his jacket. You brought friends, David said calmly. I'm disappointed, Jake. I thought we could handle this as family. We're not family, Jake repeated. And this ends tonight. David pulled out a gun, but before he could raise it completely, Jake moved with the speed and determination of someone who had been preparing for this moment his entire life. He tackled David around the waist, and both of them went down hard on the rocky ground beside the quarry. The gun went off once, the sound echoing across the water. Sarah screamed and bolted from the surveillance van, Agent Walsh right behind her. By the time they reached the quarry's edge, David was lying motionless on the ground, blood pooling beneath his head, where it had struck the rocks during the fall. Jake was sitting beside him, holding the gun that had fallen from David's hand, his face pale but determined. It's over, he said as the FBI agents surrounded them. He's dead. It's finally over. But Sarah could see in her son's eyes that it wasn't really over. The truth about his father, about her family's complicity in decades of abuse, about the childhood trauma he had carried alone for so long. All of that would take years to process and heal from. David's death was just the end of one chapter in a story that would continue for the rest of their lives. As the medical examiner confirmed David's death and the FBI began processing the scene, Sarah held her son close and tried to process what they had learned. Jake had been abused by his father before they had ever moved to Millfield. David had recognized the signs and had used Jake's previous trauma to manipulate him into silence about new abuse. Her father had been complicit in covering up decades of crimes, and her entire family history was built on a foundation of secrets and lies that went back generations. The truth hadn't set them free, but maybe, finally, it would allow them to start healing. As they walked away from the quarry together, leaving David's body and the wreckage of their family's secrets behind, Sarah realized that their real work was just beginning. They had survived David Mitchell, but now they had to learn how to live with the knowledge of what he had done, what he had made them complicit in, and what it would mean for their future. The silence that had protected them for 18 years was finally broken. Now they had to find their voices and figure out how to use them. 2 years have passed since that night at the quarry, and Sarah still wakes up sometimes expecting to find Jake's notebook under his mattress, still checks the locks on their doors twice before bed, still feels her heart skip when she sees an unfamiliar car parked too long on their street. The hypervigilance that kept them alive during David's reign of terror has been harder to shake than either of them anticipated. But they're healing. Slowly, carefully, with the help of therapists who specialize in family trauma and the support of other survivors who understand what it means to rebuild a life after everything you thought you knew about your family turns out to be a lie. The investigation that followed David's death uncovered a network of abuse and cover-up that reached into dozens of families across multiple states. Sarah's father's meticulous records led to the recovery of 7 bodies, including Michael Chen's remains, which were found buried in a construction site David's company had worked on 20 years earlier. The families finally had answers, finally had closure, finally had proof that their children's disappearances hadn't been their fault. Jake testified before a grand jury that indicted 3 other family members for their roles in the cover-up, including Sarah's uncle Robert, who had helped move bodies, and her cousin Dennis, who had laundered money used to pay off victims' families. The Mitchell family tree, once a source of pride and tradition, had become evidence in a federal criminal case. But the most difficult revelation came from Jake's recovered memories of his father's abuse. With the help of his therapist, Jake slowly pieced together fragments of trauma from his earliest years, memories that his young mind had buried so deeply they had been inaccessible until David's manipulation brought them back to the surface. Sarah struggled with guilt that felt oceanic in its scope. She had failed to protect Jake from his father's abuse, had missed the signs that something was wrong, had actually moved him closer to another predator in her desperate attempt to provide him with a stable home. The fact that she couldn't have known, that Mark had been careful to hide his crimes, and that David had been a master manipulator, didn't ease the weight of her self-recrimination. "You were a victim too," Dr. Reynolds reminded her during their family therapy sessions. "David targeted your family specifically because he knew about Jake's previous trauma. He researched you, studied you, positioned himself to be your savior so that he could have access to your son. You didn't bring Jake to a predator. A predator brought himself to you." The legal proceedings dragged on for months. David's death had prevented a trial that would have brought national attention to the case, but the federal investigation into the family conspiracy resulted in convictions for obstruction of justice, accessory after the fact, and racketeering charges for several Mitchell family members. Sarah's mother received probation in exchange for her cooperation, but she aged a decade in the span of the trial, the weight of keeping family secrets for so long finally crushing her spirit. Jake threw himself into advocacy work, speaking at conferences about child abuse prevention, and working with legislators to strengthen laws protecting children from predators who operate within families. His voice, silent for so long, became a powerful tool for change. He testified before Congress about the need for better training for social workers and teachers, about the ways family loyalty can be weaponized by abusers, about the importance of believing children when they try to speak up. "Silence was my survival mechanism," he told a packed auditorium at a national conference on child protection. But silence also enabled my abuser to continue hurting other children. We have to create safe spaces for children to speak their truth, and we have to believe them when they do. Sarah found her own voice too, working with families of other victims to navigate the complex trauma of discovering that someone they trusted had been a monster. She learned that the signs she had missed weren't really signs at all, that David had been skilled at presenting different faces to different people, that even trained professionals had been fooled by his carefully constructed persona. The house in Millfield became too heavy with memories to continue living in. They moved to a different state, closer to Sarah's college friend Linda, who had provided unwavering support through the worst of their ordeal. Jake finished high school through an online program and was accepted to several universities with strong criminal justice programs. He wanted to become an FBI agent, to dedicate his life to hunting predators who thought they could hide behind respectability and family connections. The notebook Jake had kept as a child was entered into evidence in the federal case, but Sarah had made copies of every page. She kept them in a safe deposit box, along with the photographs of David's other victims and the records her father had maintained. They were evidence of crimes that could never be fully prosecuted, testimony from children who deserved to have their stories preserved and honored. On quiet evenings, when Jake was studying for his college entrance exams, and Sarah was grading papers from her new job teaching elementary school, she would sometimes think about the other families out there who might be living with secrets they didn't understand. Families where children were struggling with unexplained fears, where trusted relatives had access they shouldn't have, where the signs of abuse were being explained away by adults who couldn't imagine that someone they loved could be capable of such crimes. The letters from other survivors continued to arrive regularly. Families who had seen Jake's testimony on television, who recognized their own stories in his words, who were finally finding the courage to speak up about abuse that had happened decades earlier. Each letter was a reminder that David's crimes had ripple effects that would continue for generations, but also that healing was possible when truth finally had a voice. Jake kept in touch with Tommy Henderson's family, who had moved to Oregon after their son's death was confirmed. Tommy's parents had struggled with guilt similar to Sarah's, wondering if they could have done something differently, if they could have saved their son and prevented David from hurting other children. But they found comfort in knowing that Tommy's notebook had been crucial evidence in building the case against David's co-conspirators, that their son's careful documentation had helped bring justice to other families. On the second anniversary of David's death, Sarah and Jake visited Michael Chen's grave for the first time. His parents, now in their 70s, had finally been able to hold a proper funeral for their son after his remains were recovered. They thanked Jake for his courage in speaking up, for making it possible for them to know what had happened to their child. "Michael would have been proud of you," his mother told Jake as they stood beside the small headstone. "He always wanted to help other children. In a way, his story helping to stop David means he finally got to do that." That evening, as they drove home through the early autumn darkness, Jake turned to his mother with an expression she hadn't seen since he was very young. Peaceful, settled, free. "I think I'm ready to stop looking over my shoulder," he said quietly. "I think I'm ready to live, like David can't hurt us anymore." Sarah reached over and squeezed his hand. "What changed?" "Understanding that what happened to me, what happened to Michael and Tommy and all the others, it wasn't about us. It was about him. We were just children living our lives, and he was a monster who decided to target us. That's not our shame to carry anymore." The road ahead stretched out in front of them, dark but no longer threatening. For the first time in 18 years, they were driving toward a future that belonged entirely to them, unencumbered by the secrets and lies that had defined their past. The silence that had once protected them was gone, replaced by voices that were strong and clear and determined to make sure no other child would have to carry the burden they had carried for so long. David Mitchell was dead. His co-conspirators were in prison. His victims had been identified and honored. The truth had been told. And finally, after 18 years of silence, Sarah and Jake Mitchell were free to speak, to heal, and to build a life that was truly their own. The nightmare was over. The real work of recovery could finally begin. In the end, the boy who had stayed silent for 18 years had found his voice, and when he used it, he had changed everything.